And all of that means that the mechanisms, but also the kinds of things that you do when you do machine to machine is inherently different when you do user to machine. That also gives us an opportunity to do something called intent-based access control. And that is that you can capture the intent. What is that client supposed to be doing to the server? And say, if that's what it's supposed to be doing, I'm going to make sure that's the only thing that it's allowed to do. And in fact, the set of clients that have declared their intents, that's the only thing that the server will allow anyone to do.
That was part of a conversation that we had with Uri Sarid on intent-based access control. Uri is the CPO and co-founder of Otterize, a company that's really looking at making access control transparent for developers through intent-based access control, or IBAC. But before Otterize, Uri has a long history of fundamental roles and leadership in tech. That includes being the CTO of MuleSoft, being the Vice President of Nook Cloud for Barnes & Noble, and the VP of Engineering for Loyalize, plus many more positions. Uri has lots of experience in these fields, and his insights are really valuable. So you're going to want to stick around and hear what he has to say. But right now, it's time to take a look at our breach of the week. This week's Breach of the Week, we're going back and having a look at something we'd previously covered. Western Digital, which is a personal data storage solution company, they mainly build hardware devices to store personal information, but they also have some offerings in the cloud. Western Digital suffered a fairly significant breach, which shut down their services for a long time. So what has evolved over the past couple of weeks? Well, the MyCloud services has been taken back online, but it appears that the hackers that broke into Western Digital Corp stole around 10 terabytes of data. It's also reported that the attackers are asking for an 8-figure ransom fee, or they're going to release the 10 terabytes of stolen data publicly. The hackers also claim to have control of the company's code signing certificate, company's executive private numbers, SAP-backed office data, and administration access to the company's Microsoft Azure cloud instance. There are a couple really interesting things that have evolved on this breach. Number one is that the attackers actually said that they never really targeted Western Digital. They kind of stumbled across vulnerabilities randomly, and it was a company where they were able to access. This shows a kind of current trend in what we're seeing with supply chain attacks and also scattergun approaches to discovering vulnerabilities. Whereas your organization doesn't necessarily specifically need to be a target for the attackers to start with, for it to end up with them infiltrating your system. So again, if you're a Western Digital customer that's using MyCloud, now is time to check to see if there's any sensitive information in your files and make sure to revoke anything that you can that may provide access. We still don't know more on the specific vulnerabilities that the attackers in this case were able to exploit to gain initial access. But one of the things that we absolutely need to ensure is that we have strict, tight access control. And areas like IBAC, intent-based access control, can really help us with this. This brings us into a good segue to dive into our conversation with Uri and Dwayne on intent-based access control.
So just kind of dive straight into it. Otterize, when you look at it, you're really focused on the non-human entities and authorizing the proper rights for non-human entities connecting together through DevOps systems. Primarily, I think anyone that looks at your website would think Apache first and foremost, but could you maybe just walk us through a high level of that problem set? Like how is authenticating and authorizing non-human entities different than working with humans?
Sure. So first thing is when you put it that way, non-human entities, it sounds like we're talking about some mysterious thing, but the reality is that most of the world of software, right, if you look at the back end of most of the software, and these days that's a huge part of our world, is services talking to each other, right? Yes, there are humans involved, of course, right? When you buy something, there's a human buying it, unless it's, of course, Google Assistant that's buying it for you. But to a large extent, everything that happens after that is services talking to each other. So really, the human to service authentication and authorization, while it's critical, is only the top of an iceberg of services talking to each other. And I saw a lot of this, of course, in my previous position as CTO of MuleSoft, where we were integrating services together. That's the majority of the work, is how do you make services talk to each other? And so what we're here to do is to make sure that you're also making sure that only services that are supposed to talk to each other are doing so, just like you're making sure that only humans that are supposed to talk to the services are doing so. That's really the framing of the problem. It's service to service authentication and authorization. Sometimes because you really want to make it more secure than what it is now. Sometimes because it's just obvious that that's the way you connect. When you connect to a shared platform like RDS, you're always authenticating and authorizing. There's no such thing as doing it without that. So we just want to make that really, really simple. The outcome is, of course, a much more secure infrastructure or environment that you have. But sometimes it's to make things easy. Sometimes it's to make things secure.
Something that jumped out to me that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into is the intent-based access control. So I understand what you were saying before, machine-to-machine authentication. I get that, and I understand the problems with that. But what can you define a little bit for me? What are intent-based access control?
Yeah. So I'll actually do that. I'll get back to actually that answer by finishing to answer what Dwayne just asked, and then you'll see how the intent-based actually fits into that, right? So you asked me about the difference between how machines authenticate and authorize versus how humans authenticate and authorize. And the mechanisms, as we know, are quite different because they are different entities. Humans, there's a human aspect to it, right? You might ask for a username and password. That's not something that you would normally think as best practices for a machine to have it know a password. You can ask humans to, refresh their credentials every hour. Good luck with that. But with machines, you actually have a chance to get them to refresh those credentials. So the actual mechanisms are quite different. And the things themselves are quite different. Machines tend to do the same thing over and over again. Humans, who knows? So the fact that a service is supposed to do something is actually something we can lean into and say, if you're supposed to do that, let's make sure you can only do that. Whereas for humans, there's much more connection often to the application that you're doing, that you're interacting with. So you have a lot more permissions, you have a lot more scopes. There's a lot of sort of it's not so much uncertainty, but a much bigger surface area of the kind of authorization you need to provide, which means usually authorization is almost part of the application that you're talking about. It's very connected with the business logic. Whereas in the case of machines talking to each other, they tend to do the same kind of thing over and over again. Again, I saw this from the MuleSoft perspective in that you open up APIs, and APIs are kind of designed to do a very specific thing. They're not supposed to be a general purpose interface. There's an API to do this and an API to do that. And all of that means that the mechanisms, but also the kinds of things that you do when you do machine to machine is inherently different when you do user to machine. That also gives us an opportunity to do something called intent-based access control. And that is that you can capture the intent. What is that client supposed to be doing to the server? And say, if that's what it's supposed to be doing, I'm going to make sure that's the only thing that it's allowed to do. And in fact, the set of clients that have declared their intents, that's the only thing that the server will allow anyone to do. So again, something quite different than what you can do with a person. If you can somehow figure out the intent of people, boy, we should go productize that. That's really interesting. But I do know the intents of a service, or at least the developer of that client knows the intents of the client. I want to go and call the order service and I want to get the latest orders. That's an intent. You built your code as a client of the order service to go and do that. What we're saying is, all you have to tell us is the intent of that client. You have to go and you say, okay, you intend to call the order service, and we take that and we turn that into a set of permissions on the order service, on the server, to say, okay, well, guess what? Let this client make that call. And anybody who hasn't declared that intent, don't let them make any calls. So you end up protecting the order service at the same time as you allow its clients to do their thing, because we're able to capture the intent of the clients and turn those into permissions. That's what's new about this. You, as a client developer, do the easiest thing. You just tell me, what do you want to do? And on the permission side, we automatically let you do those things and don't let anything that's undeclared happen.
Maybe I can just make sure that I understand this, that because we know that a machine is doing a specific job, we can really restrict what it's able to do. right? So something that attackers do is they use services in unintended ways. If
Yes.
we limit them, whatever. Okay, so this leads me to this question: why are we talking about this? As in, why has this not been implemented from the beginning? It's one of those things that's so obvious, and I know it hasn't. What's the challenge behind it? Why is it difficult to be able to implement this intent-based access control?
It's a great question. And it actually dovetails into why we started Otterize and why I decided this was going to be the next thing that I'm going to do. Because I remember standing on stage in Chicago, I forget, 2017, 2016, something like that, giving one of my presentations about sort of the future of APIs and distributed services and things of that sort, and saying that, when we have this kind of machine to machine infrastructure, we called it the application network back then, there will be incredibly good ways to do security. You can basically ask the machines and figure out what are they all doing and figure out, is this all intentional and all of this kind of stuff. And I got tired of just standing up there and talking about how it should be. I think I even wrote some blog back then about how I think the whole world should go in this direction, because if we can figure out what things are supposed to happen, we are very good at automating and making sure that everything else is not going to happen. And so various things interfered. I don't know. We had a pandemic. We had a whole bunch of things that happened since then. But when I got together with my two co-founders, it was just the obvious thing to go and try to productize. I can't tell you why it hasn't happened so far, but now it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's great that you brought up that. I mean, there's a blog that you wrote on TechCrunch 6 years ago that dives into the intent-based programming. 6 years ago in the software world that we live, I mean, that's a generation, right? I mean, when you look about the technologies that have been created. So, I mean, before we kind of move away from this topic, you've been thinking about this for 6 years. Do you think that this is really going to be the standard that we all apply? Will it enable us to basically become more secure, develop faster, and build better automations if this becomes a standard?
I totally think so. But I also think so because, fortunately, I'm far from the originator of this general concept or the only one that believes in it. There's this platform you might have heard of called Kubernetes. I was super excited when Kubernetes came out and saw intent-based infrastructure actually realized, right? Here's something, and arguably Docker even before that, here's something where you just write a manifest that basically declares, here's what I want to have happen. And then somebody else is responsible to make sure it happens without you having to worry about how. I mean, if you want, you can go back to Puppet and other platforms that even did that before, where it was much more about declaring what you want the outcome to be, and then letting other layers in the middle go and make that happen. And I think from my perspective, that's the only way that we're actually going to be able to make progress in large distributed software systems, is not having people figure out every little bit of how things happen, but rather have humans or somebody declare at a high level, this is what I'd like to have happen, and let layers underneath that happen. Kubernetes is built that way, right? It's intent-based to begin with. You tell me at the high level, you tell me a deployment, I'm going to go actually figure out the pods and lay them out and all of those details. So Kubernetes is built that way. That's what I love about the sort of the cloud native market, is that the whole mindset is declare what you want at a higher level and make it happen. And we're just happening to do exactly that for access controls, because there's an opportunity with machines to capture their intents, and therefore you can actually turn that into automatic access controls. And I think it will catch on because it's such an obvious idea, and because it takes away so much of the pain that people are encountering today. When I joined MuleSoft in 2013 and we started to add API capabilities, we immediately saw that the number one barrier to APIs is actually authentication and authorization to some extent, right? That's the friction. And people tried to solve that, OAuth came out and so on. But here we are. It's still the number one pain if you ask API developers, like, how do I actually get connected to that API? It's I have to work through the authentication and the authorization. So it's an ongoing pain. And if we can make that pain just go away, I think we got something.
I remember when the declarative infrastructure first started becoming mainstream, and it was kind of like, have you heard about the YAML file yet? There was those that
Yes,
those that were doing it, and those that were not. I imagine that this is, it seems so obvious, and the same that the declarative infrastructure is. It's like, why can't we declare our end state and let it figure
right.
out? And then it's the same here.
Exactly.
So it sounds like you have been very much for a long while here, very focused on what's the forefront of technology. What is the bleeding edge coming? What's the leading edge that we're all should be leaning into? So the hot topic right now, and I would love to get your just hot take on this, is how do you see things like Chat GPT, machine learning, AI impacting this part of DevOps? If you can
Yeah.
limit it to just calling it DevOps, what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll try to answer it in the following way, and you can tell me if I'm not answering your question. I'll go back and try again.
Fair
Um,
enough.
One thing is just to clarify as far as sort of bleeding edge, right? I think there are tremendous numbers of technologies that you can call them on the bleeding edge. I used to be a particle theorist, and as a particle theorist, it's a very snobby approach that, oh, all this stuff that they call technology, well, that's just engineering, right? We are doing the real cutting edge. But the reality is that until it gets to engineering, until it gets to something you can do something with, it's just a bunch of academic papers. So I'm not talking about technology that's sitting in academic papers. I'm talking about something that actually is going to change our world. And that's what I consider sort of the important bleeding edge. And that's where I pay my attention. So I do think that intent-based programming in general changes our world, is necessary. And similarly, I think that ChatGPT has shown us that AI has reached a point where it will actually change our world. It's no longer for playing chess. It's really going to change the way that we're going to interact. They even wrote a blog about it on the Otterize blog. Um, and the way that I think that it's going to change things is that um, the way that people do things, whether it's DevOps or whether it's buying online or anything like that, will be through agents rather than directly. That's, I think, what's different. Right now, we're talking about writing emails through agents, right, through chatbots and so on. And I'm not talking about voice bots. That has almost nothing to do with this. This is bots that actually have some level of intelligence and can actually do something, not just understand the words you say. So in that world, if everybody is acting through bots, you, for example, market to bots. You don't market to people because the bots are the ones that are going to recommend to the people what to do. Well, wait, who's right? Who's doing not a search engine optimization, but a bot optimization marketing platform? I don't know of anybody who's doing that. Similarly, who is opening up APIs that bots can consume versus that developers can consume? I don't know of anybody that's doing that. So I'm just saying, I think we're going to go through a tremendous amount of change, societal change, because the target is now the bots, not necessarily the people. The bots are the intermediaries. And it's in that world, it's in that sense that I think all our lives are going to change as a result of this. And things like intent-based access controls will just be another manifestation where you figure out the intent maybe a little bit more automatically by looking at pattern recognition so developers don't have to declare their intents. And then the access controls kind of flow through them.
I want to dig into something you said there just for a second, not to rabbit hole on it, but buying through agents or agents doing purchasing. First time I've ever heard anyone bring that up, believe it or not. Maybe you could just explain what that means just a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. It used to be 20 years ago that if you had a business trip, you would talk to some travel agent or your, assistant or somebody, and you'd say, I'm super busy, but I know I need to be at this conference and I need to meet these customers and so on. Make the trip happen for me, right? And they would go and they'd figure out what are the best flights, what are the best hotels, how do I get from place to place? Do you want to see some shows after work and so on and so forth? And they go orchestrate all of that together and they go buy the tickets and they go buy the airplane tickets and so on, right? So I didn't need to go and do the buying. Well, why don't they do the buying? Well, bots can do exactly that. There's no reason with APIs they can't actually do that if you trust them enough. And I think they're getting to the point where the trust might be close enough that all I might have to do today is say, yep, that looks reasonable, or no, why are these flights spaced so closely together? And so the rest happens. So now the bots are coming to me with recommendations or maybe even executing these things, which means that if you want to market to somebody, you better market to those bots, not to me. It's like marketing to your assistant. Why market to me? They're the ones who are going to do 90% of the legwork here.
That makes total sense. I also really appreciate what you said about the difference between academic research that's in white papers being tied up there versus what we see in the real world. I just had the privilege of attending the International Conference on Cyber Warfare and Security and saw a number of papers that people presented as if IT is this ethereal cloud idea, not cloud servers, but idea just out there in space that is disconnected from what we do day to day. And it was kind of eye opening for me to see like how much there is just this bubble of so much research being done that probably isn't going to see the light of day, or if it does, it will be way past the point where it would have been useful. But at the same time, that's where I think a lot of ideas and conferences like the one I attended is where people start talking about those things and applying those ethereal white ivory tower ideas to real world, because I walked away with a few new ideas of how to approach a couple of projects.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in fundamental research. Don't get me wrong, right? It's nothing that I did there, is something that I regret. On the other hand, I realized that for me, doing research and publishing papers, and maybe something that what I say will come true in 20 years from now, is incompatible with a human lifetime. And so I wanted to get stuff done in a time that I could see the returns on it. And so I switched out of theoretical physics. So I think, quantum computing, incredibly important. But what I like to do is things that are a little bit more short-term based. And maybe that's, seems like I'm going down the pyramid rather than up. But I actually think that in terms of actual impact, somebody also needs to translate that and recognize which ones it's time to act on now, and deal with that. And that's kind of where my head is at these days.
I want to go, seeing as we've entered into this realm, I want to go on a more theoretical side. One of the limitations that we face in technology is often security. Once we solve the security issues, then we unleash technology to be used in ways that we didn't expect, because we're confident that we can do that. Right. Now, moving back to APIs and everything, if we can secure our APIs to a way that we didn't before, and for this world that is using AI, if we solve the problem of access control for APIs, how does this change how we use APIs? How does this change the direction, the theoretical direction, the white paper, if you will, of where we can go with the technology that we're using?
Yeah. Let me answer it sort of in a funny way. It's not so much that it changes the direction. The direction is already going. The world is becoming a lot more composable. So the question is whether we do it in a responsible way or not. So the reality is that, and I can quote, so I can make an analogy with what's happened recently with banking, but like the world is already going in this direction. Lots and lots of services are already connecting to each other. And we have a trust, which I would say is more of a hope, that everything will just keep working the way it's supposed to work until it doesn't one day. And then you realize, oh my God, I don't have access to my cash. Or, oh my God, like all my transportation systems are not working. Or, oh my gosh, the electric grid is down, or, and so on. So what I think is really important for us to do is to recognize that we're not about changing the direction. We're about making the direction more trustworthy and making sure that, in fact, nobody can compromise this foundation that we're building our lifestyle on. That's really, I think, what it's all about. I want to get to the point where the infrastructure that we're all relying upon to increasingly automate our lives and be able to spend our time more productively and so on is a trustworthy one. I don't think it has to be done by completely reinventing anything. In many cases, what I've seen when there are security problems is you haven't done even the basics. You haven't made sure that only the services that can connect to each other, it's called zero trust. It's a big term, but only the services that connect to each other should connect to each other. I mean, it seems obvious, but, again, an analogy is, imagine that the way that you ran your business, you all lived in one big office building, and you were very careful about whom to give the keys to that office building. But once they go in the office building, they can go to any office that they want. They can change whatever they want. Nobody uses any passwords on their laptops. Good luck. I mean, that's what periphery-based defenses are on. That's crazy, right? Nobody would run things like that. We all still insist on using passwords on our laptops, even inside of our offices. Well, why don't we do that for all the rest of our infrastructure?
Absolutely, and I mean, this is something I've struggled with in security for a long time, because I mean, you look at the security headlines, it's getting a little bit better, but a year ago, 2 years ago, every single week you had a new unsecure Amazon S3 bucket that was discovered by someone, and then all the data inside was it. Why is it the default that it's open? Like, why isn't the default, like, the intention isn't that it was meant to be open? So
Exactly.
Why is it that it's ended up? And what you're saying makes total sense.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is very simple. It's if the default word secure, then you're introducing friction at the one point that you don't want as a platform to have friction, which is at the beginning. You don't want to make it hard to get started. So you make it easy to get started, but then nobody goes back and locks it back up. If you could make it easy to get started, and that's what I love about intent-based access control, you just capture the intent. That's the one thing that doesn't change. So if you make it super easy to get started, and then it's by default secure, you get, to have your cake and eat it too.
It's interesting, always interesting to me that technology evolves to make our lives simpler. Like Kafka's mission was to connect all of these services, yet we just made a whole new pile of work for ourselves, and that's why companies like yours exist. But I do want to wrap things up here. I appreciate your time spending with us. But I have one last question, and it is specific to Otterize. Otters, of course, are really cute animals, and we all love them, and we love your mascot. But I've never heard otter used as a verb. So can you explain that name a little bit?
Yeah, it's very simple. It's Otterize in a Hebrew accent.
I like it. Yeah, Otterize. Yes. Okay. In cybersecurity, it seems that everyone's using some kind of hunting bird as their logo. We have an owl. There's a bunch of other owls. There's falcons and everything. So when I saw the otter, the cute, friendly logo, it was
Yes.
I quite liked the story.
Yes, we want to be a cute, friendly company. We don't want to be on the security, scare everyone's side. We have no such aggressive side to this. We figure that, if we could make it really sweet for the developers, then they'll actually adopt it. And what I like to think is that security that's not adopted remains as a white paper. We want security to be built into these systems, and we have to go for make it really, really easy and attractive to adopt.
Well, Uri, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us and joining us on the Security Repo podcast. It was really, really interesting. The final thing, just to note here, is you're quite prolific in terms of there's lots of content out there. Where can people go to kind of read some of your content, follow you, follow the journey of Otterize? What's some of the best links that we could share?
Yeah, we're going to try to keep putting content on our blog. That'll be kind of the main one. And then from then on, it's where, we're going to try to figure out where developers go, where platform engineers go, and make sure that our content appears there. But a good starting point is from our website. And if we're doing our job right, we'll help you find it there. And then in general, I love YouTube. So over time, look there as well.
Great. Thanks again, Uri. And we hope that we get to see you again in the future.
My sincere pleasure. Thank you.